Let's clear something up right out of the gate. Medieval people weren't drunk all the time because they were stupid. They were drunk all the time because they had to be. Well, mostly. The line between necessity and pleasure was porous, like most medieval infrastructure. But no, they didn't drink because they were too primitive to invent clean water. That's a lazy myth. And if you've heard it, someone owes you an apology and probably a refund. There was clean water springs, wells, rain cisterns, but drink it in the wrong town, at the wrong hour, and you might as well swallow the plague directly. Because medieval cities were plumbing in reverse, everything flowed out into the streets, and nothing came back clean. Rivers doubled as sewers, laundromats, and occasionally places to dump bodies you'd rather not explain. So, yes, they drank beer, ale, cider, and wine. A lot of it. Not because it made them merry, but because it didn't kill them, mostly. Now, imagine you're a Londoner in the year 1388. You wake up in your flea-ridden straw mattress to the sound of your neighbor hacking up what sounds like his own lungs, which he probably is. You brush your teeth with a twig, if you're fancy, and you head straight for breakfast. A hunk of rye bread, a bit of salty cheese, and a mug of small ale, basically a low-alcohol beer brewed to kill off the worst bacteria, not your dignity. Think of it as the medieval smoothie, nutritious, hydrating, vaguely gross. The household brewing operation was often run by women, by the way, alewives they were called. And if you're picturing a rosy-cheeked, motherly type with a wooden spoon, think again. These were cutthroat businesswomen operating under brutal market conditions. If your ale was too weak, too cloudy, or not up to the mayor's standard, yes, they had ale tasters, a real job. You could be fined, shamed, or if you were really unlucky tied to the cucking stool and dunked into the river. That's right, failed to kill the germs in your ale, and they tried to kill you with some justice, medieval style. In Exeter, England, court rolls from the 14th century list over 80 women fined in a single year for selling ale by false measure. That's not sloppy math, it's economic sabotage. See, you're not just hydrating the public, you're profiting off its desperation. There were no purity laws, no health inspectors. Your best protection against dysentery was the honesty of a woman trying to make rent. But drinking wasn't just for the desperate. Monks drank too, especially monks. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed moderation, but medieval moderation was interpretive. At Westminster Abbey, the monks were allotted a gallon of ale per day. That's one monk, 1 gallon. But they weren't pounding it like frat boys, they were using it like liquid bread. Dense, filling, calorie-rich. Ale was food, and food was piety. Except when it wasn't. Because even in monasteries, things got rowdy. At Tavistock Abbey in the early 14th century, a monk named William Gervase was accused of smashing up the refectory, threatening fellow monks with a sword, and of course being drunk. He was exiled for 7 years. The real crime? Not the violence. It was drinking without permission. Alcohol was sacred, as long as it stayed in its place. Now, head over to Paris, around the year 1370. The air smells like horse piss, wood smoke, and onion. Everyone's carrying jugs, everyone. Even children drank diluted wine or ale. Because water was suspect, but also because drinking together was a kind of armor, a public ritual. In taverns, people swore oaths, sealed deals, made marriages and, occasionally, stabbed each other over a spilled drink. In a city without police, the tavern was church, courthouse, and war zone. And if you were rich, oh, then drinking was a theatrical event. Charles IV of France so fancy he once died of eating too many eel-sloved elaborate wine rituals. At royal banquets, you didn't just drink wine. You drank it from goblets shaped like birds, flowing from fountains carved into mythological beasts, served by boys in embroidered liveries. It wasn't about thirst, it was about hierarchy. The richer the wine, the fewer hands it passed through. Power distilled, 1 cup at a time. But don't think the poor were left out. They had their own rituals. In the Low Countries, beer brewers guilds ran whole economies. In Ghent, one guild funded public works projects by taxing beer. In Brussels, beer financed churches. Every mug was a civic investment. Get drunk, support infrastructure. Even crime had a drinking logic. In Cologne, city statutes warned tavern owners not to permit known whores to ply their trade under the guise of serving ale, which sounds puritanical until you realize that brothels had to serve beer. It was part of the business model. Sex sold, but beer kept customers docile. And God help you if you tried to cut corners. In one case from Nuremberg in 1468, a brewer was caught diluting his beer with water from a stream that ran behind the tanneries. Yes, that stream, the one full of lime-soaked flesh and animal remains. When the authorities found out, they didn't find him. They chained him to a cart and paraded him through town while someone dumped his own beer on his head. Reputation ruined. Not just a bad brewer, a civic traitor, but it wasn't always punishment. Sometimes, beer was the solution. In Milan, when plague hit in 1349, doctors prescribed a steady intake of red wine mixed with myrrh. Why? Because it was believed that wine opened the pores and carried the disease out through sweat. If you died, you were simply too dry. And for executions, drinking was often the last rite. In England, condemned men were given ale before the gallows, not to numb the pain, to calm the crowd. A stumbling, weeping convict ruins the mood. A man who lifts his mug and says a few brave words, that's public order. But nothing compares to the college students. The University of Oxford in the 14th century was less center of learning and more high-stakes bar brawl with books. Students were armed, drunk, and lethal. In 1355, a student dispute at the Swindlestock Tavern turned into a full-blown riot. Locals were killed, shops looted, and the town nearly burned. The king had to intervene. The punishment? The town of Oxford had to march an annual penitential parade for 270 years, paying restitution to the university because someone got served sour wine. And of course, beer was political. In Bohemia, Jan Hus preacher, reformer, future heretic used alehouses as recruitment centers. He'd preach to the thirsty, rail against church corruption, then pass the mug, communion and revolution in one. When the Hussite wars broke out, beer was the soldier's reward. In fact, in the city of Tabor, the army's payment system ran on beer rations. Fight for God, drink for glory. But the strangest part, they didn't think of this as vice. Drinking was moral, as long as you stayed in your lane. The 14th century Dominican preacher John Bromyard wrote that wine was a gift of God, but warned that when men drink immoderately, the devil himself opens the tap. That's not a metaphor. That's a theological plumbing diagram. So yes, they drank. At weddings, births, wakes, at market, in church, during labor. Midwives prescribed warm beer to women in childbirth. Monks brewed it with herbs to treat melancholy. Soldiers carried it into battle. And if you dared to refuse a drink, in some regions that was a legal insult, a breach of trust. In Estonia, refusing a shared beer could be grounds for a duel. Life or death, 1 pint at a time. And all of it wrapped in rules, sumptuary laws, brewing ordinances, ale assays. In 14th century York, you could be fined for selling ale with unclean froth. In London, public drunkenness got you pilloried, but only if you were poor. Rich drunk? Quirky. Poor drunk? Criminal. But the truly damning part, the part no one wants to admit, is this. We're not so different. We have health drinks. They had small ale. We have craft breweries. They had guild halls. We have wellness influencers. They had saints and sermons and fermented horse piss in a wooden mug. Same need. Same fear. Slightly less Instagram. The medieval world wasn't drunk because it loved chaos. It drank to hold chaos back, 1 sip at a time. Through famine, plague, war, and excommunication, When God seemed absent and death was a neighbor, they reached for the one thing they could trust. Not clean, not holy, but familiar. And maybe that's the most sobering part. Because the next time you lift a glass and toast to health or God or Friday night, remember, you're reenacting an ancient survival ritual, one forged in filth, fear, and fermentation. You're not escaping history. You're swallowing it. Now, if you think the church was just standing by with a disapproving frown and a faint smell of incense, think again. The church wasn't just drinking, it was profiting. Monasteries brewed some of the finest beer in Europe, not because they were holy, but because they had the land, the labor, and the tax exemptions. The Cistercians, in particular, were basically medieval beverage tycoons. At Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, the monks ran a full-scale brewing operation, exporting barrels downriver while preaching poverty from the pulpit. And yes, technically monks took vows of abstinence, but like most rules in the medieval world, that vow came with a thick footnote and a case of semantic gymnastics. Drink was permitted. Drunkenness was not. But where exactly was the line? Somewhere between morally hydrated and accidentally Latin. The Council of Aachen tried to nail it down in the 9th century, recommending a daily allowance of about 2 pints per monk. By the 12th century, that had expanded to 4. By the 14th, it was however much you could justify with a straight face and a bloated stomach. Ask a monk how much was too much, and he'd probably cite Augustine, then belch. Even the saints weren't safe. St. Arnulf of Metz, the patron saint of brewers, supposedly saved his parishioners from plague by urging them to drink only beer. From man's sweat and God's love, beer came into the world, his followers claimed, likely while plastered. His relics were carried around like holy yeast starters, because nothing says divine protection like a jawbone that pairs well with pork. Meanwhile, out in the streets, alehouses were multiplying like rats in the grain supply. In 14th century Norwich, a city of about 50 people, there were over 350 licensed ale cellars. That's one alehouse for every 14 residents. Imagine if every other house on your block was a dive bar, and the bouncer was the mayor. And they weren't quaint, charming pubs. They were loud, filthy, and wildly unpredictable. The kind of place where you could buy a drink, lose your purse, and witness a murder before the bread hit the table. According to the London coroner's rolls, one Thomas de Hungerford was stabbed in a Southwark tavern after an argument over whether a song was French or English. The jury ruled it manslaughter, not murder. Apparently, music criticism was considered provocation. Even the legal system soaked in drink. Court records show that juries often deliberated in alehouses, with ale on the table. In one case from 14th century York, a group of jurors was fined for delivering a verdict, while in their cups, which is a polite way of saying the trial turned into a pub quiz with actual stakes. Justice was blind, also buzzed. And let's talk about hospitality. Medieval guest rights weren't just social courtesies, they were semi-sacred contracts. Offer someone a drink, and they were temporarily under your protection. Refuse to drink when offered, you risked implying mistrust, insult, or worse, heresy. In Icelandic sagas, refusing a horn of mead could be grounds for a blood feud. In parts of Germany, it was literally illegal to turn down a communal toast. You could be fined for not drinking. Imagine that at your next office party. This gets even messier when you remember that getting someone drunk wasn't just a party trick, it was a power move. In medieval Scandinavia, kings used ritual drinking to cement loyalty. The breggerful, or chieftain's cup, was passed around at feasts, and each man swore an oath before drinking. Break that oath, and you weren't just a liar. You were a blasphemer who desecrated a sacred cup, basically perjury with barley. And if you think women were sidelined in this drunken drama, think again. Alewives weren't just neighborhood vendors, they were cultural icons and moral battlegrounds. Church sermons raged against them. Mystery plays portrayed them being dragged to hell by demons, cackling with their jugs in hand. Why? Because they represented economic independence, sexual autonomy, and the terrifying possibility that a woman might serve you both ale and attitude. But some leaned into it. In Chester, alewives staged their own parody processions, dressing as devils and dragging a mock bad brewer through the streets. It was satire, protest, and advertisement all at once. "Drink our ale," it said, "or the real devils will get you." Then there's the economics. Forget gold. Forget spices. In much of medieval Europe, beer was currency. Laborers were often paid in part with ale. In Bruges, dock workers could claim up to 5 liters a day. At English harvests, workers were promised a loaf, a herring, and a gallon of ale for each day's toil. It wasn't a bonus, it was the baseline. And ale was taxed heavily. In England, the assize of ale regulated prices and quality. Officials called ale conners tested it by sitting in it. No joke. They wore leather breeches, poured ale onto a wooden bench, and sat down. If their trousers stuck, the ale was too sugary and possibly watered down. That's how you regulated public health in the 14th century, with your ass. These taxes fueled royal coffers, built bridges, repaired roads, which meant the state needed you to keep drinking. If sobriety had caught on, half the infrastructure would have collapsed. The other half would have burned in a riot started by undercaffeinated townsfolk trying to replace beer with turnip broth. Now picture the tavern again. It's dusk. The walls are low and blackened with soot. The floor is straw-covered, half mud, half mystery. A candle gutters in a horn sconce. Someone's arguing in Middle English about the last eel pie. A minstrel's singing something vaguely lewd. And in the corner, 2 men are hunched over a carved bone cup, whispering about politics because where better to hatch a plot than over ale thick enough to chew? In Bohemia, Hussite rebels built entire war councils in beer halls. In Florence, the Ciompi revolted after meetings in wine shops. Revolution fermented in tankards long before it spilled into the streets. You want to find the seeds of dissent? Don't look in cathedrals. Look under the tavern table. And then there's the tavern itself, social X-ray. Your seat, your cup, your serving girl, even your toast stall calibrated to show status. The farther you sat from the fire, the lower your rank. The bigger your mug, the more people watched. Drinking was theater, and every performance had consequences. In Paris, tavern keepers were required to hang ivy or a bundle of twigs outside their door, a sign that fresh wine or ale was available. No sign, no service. But some took this further, hanging ornate carvings, painted boards, even mechanical signs. One establishment near Rue Saint-Denis boasted a carved angel with a rotating beer barrel. Drinking wasn't just necessity, it was branding. Of course, it wasn't all merry. Every mug came with its own risk. Alcohol wasn't standardized. One batch might warm your belly, the next might blind you. Especially in regions where wine was stretched with leaded syrup or beer brewed with dodgy herbs. The worst culprits? Tavern keepers on the edge of bankruptcy, willing to cut corners for coin. Lead poisoning wasn't a theory, it was Tuesday. So when people drank, they weren't just relaxing, they were gambling, with their health, their wallets, and sometimes their souls. And yet, they drank. Through plague, famine, schism, and crusade, they lifted the mug again. Not to forget, but to remember the dead, the saints, the feast days, the promises, the bargains sealed with a sip and a spit shake. The world was unstable, brutal, and short. Ale gave it rhythm. Wine gave it meaning. Cider gave it bite. And when things got really bad, when the crops failed, the armies came, and the priests stopped making sense, people didn't stop drinking. They brewed harder. And you'd think, maybe, after all this, after the riots, the taxes, the poisonings, the dunkings, the hangings, the sermons, and the lawsuits, maybe people would have pulled back. Maybe some sharp-eyed bishop or reforming mayor would say, enough. But this wasn't just thirst. It was scaffolding. In the town of Lübeck, in the 15th century, civic records show that when a public fountain was installed, residents still preferred their ale. They demanded their ale. Because the fountain had no soul, no story, no warmth. Ale had been there during births, wakes, weddings, and plagues. The fountain? A cold outsider. Even in hospitals, especially in hospitals, alcohol was considered medicinal. At St. Bartholomew's in London, the infirmary budget included generous barrels of ale per patient, not out of charity. Out of doctrine. Wine was hot and dry in the Galenic system, good for the old and cold-blooded. Ale was damp and nourishing for the melancholy and weak. Every sip had a diagnosis. You didn't drink for fun. You drank for balance. And if you couldn't afford it, you begged. And if begging didn't work, you stole. In one recorded case from Durham in 1389, a man was caught sneaking into a church ale festival, a charity fundraiser, technically to pilfer a mug and vanish into the crowd. He wasn't prosecuted. He was beaten, because you could steal money, you could steal bread, but ale was communal. That was sacrilege. Even the church festivals revolved around drink. Church ales, they were called part fundraisers, part moral gamble. The whole village would turn up, pay a fee, get their fill, and pretend it wasn't technically a party. Surplus funds went to roof repairs or the poor. But more than a few clergy went home with regrets and a headache. Preaching temperance was one thing. Selling pints under a tent next to the chapel? Different sermon. And when the Protestants came in swinging, they didn't ban drinking, they redirected it. Martin Luther himself loved beer. His wife brewed it. He wrote tracts with a stein nearby. Calvinists were sterner, yes, but even they permitted drinking in moderation. Biblical moderation, which is a fun phrase until you realize the Bible also features wedding feasts that last 7 days in vineyards planted by naked patriarchs. Meanwhile, England's gin-soaked future was already fermenting in its past. As hops started replacing traditional gruita medieval mix of herbs and bark, the beer changed. It lasted longer, traveled better, tasted different, and sparked panic. In 1516, the Munich Purity Law, Reinheitsgebot, tried to standardize beer ingredients. No coriander, no heather, no wild roots, just water, barley, and hops. A medieval version of regulation, but also a quiet cultural war. Taste versus shelf life. Old brew versus the new empire of export. The old alewives suffered. Their brews, made with local herbs and small batches, were deemed suspicious, unclean, even witchy. And that wasn't metaphor. Because by the late 15th century, the line between brewer and witch had begun to blur. Women with knowledge of fermentation, herbs, and ritual, who brewed in cauldrons, wore tall hats for visibility in the market, and kept cats to ward off grain-eating mice. Yeah. The witch stereotype wasn't conjured out of nowhere. It bubbled upright out of the brew kettle. In Germany, some of the earliest witch accusations were tied to failed batches of beer and unexplained sicknesses after drinking. Convenient scapegoats, useful when men wanted to consolidate guild power, useful when economies shifted, useful when fear needed a feminine face. Drinking, once a feminine domain, became a masculine ritual, and where women once controlled the flow, now they stood trial for poisoning the well. But the mugs still clinked. By the late Middle Ages, public drinking had become performative again, this time in cities teetering on the edge of modernity. In Venice, gondoliers sipped wine between songs. In Krakow, burghers drank in cellars lined with oak and torchlight. In London, taverns stretched down alleys like ribs on a skeleton. The old fears remained, but so did the old habits. And when printing presses came, the first advertisements? Beer, ale, remedies in bottles, miracle cures with alcohol as the base. You could now read about why you should drink while drinking. Literacy and intoxication, medieval style. But maybe the most twisted part, the detail that folds time like a bad alchemy experimentus, this: we still do it. We still drink to survive, to mourn, to flirt, to forget. We toast to beginnings and ends. We drink in public and hope not to embarrass ourselves. We drink to bridge gaps and make confessions. We drink because we're afraid to feel too much too fast. And most of the rituals? They're medieval. Happy hour is a descendant of the church ale. The one for the road echoes the drink offered before execution. The awkward office party? A pale echo of the feudal feast. And the hangover? Still medieval. Still earned. So when you raise a glass, you're not just drinking. You're reenacting 1,000 years of fear, joy, labor, and survival. You're speaking in the oldest language of community. One gulp, one nod, one hand on the table. Because they didn't drink to escape the darkness. They drank to light a fire in the middle of it. And maybe, just maybe, we still do.